for a murder. No one will ever know what happened. No comment.
I killed them. I am evil. I did this.
No, you don't.
Don't look, Mum. Let's go.
We have all heard the story. Lucy Letby, the most prolific child serial killer in modern British history, sentenced to spend the rest of her life in a cold concrete cell. But what if the real killer was not a person at all? What if the real killer was a crumbling, underfunded hospital system terrified of a massive multi-million-dollar negligence lawsuit? Just recently, 14 of the top neonatal experts globally reviewed the medical evidence used to lock her up. Their conclusion: zero evidence of murder. None. Did the National Health Service cover up 5 crucial facts to frame an innocent nurse and save their own reputation? I have spent the past few weeks digging deep into the official court transcripts, the medical reports, the police timelines, and listening to the brave doctors who are finally speaking out. And I have to tell you, what I found is absolutely terrifying. So, let us start with the place where everything supposedly happened, the Countess of Chester Hospital. When you hear about a neonatal unit, you probably picture a modern, sterile, and high-tech sanctuary. You imagine a place where tiny, fragile lives are protected by the most advanced medicine and the cleanest environments possible. But the thing is, the reality inside this specific unit during 2015 and 2016 was nothing like that polished image. It was actually a crumbling facility that was struggling just to keep its head above water. To understand why this matters, we need to look at how these units are actually ranked. In the medical world, hospitals have different levels of care for newborns. A level 3 unit is the big league. Those are the intensive care centers equipped with the best specialists and the most resources to handle the smallest babies, born extremely early. The Countess of Chester, however, was only a level 2 local neonatal unit. It was designed for babies who needed a little extra help or those who were not quite as critical. But because a nearby hospital had closed its doors, the Countess of Chester suddenly started taking in babies that were far too sick and far too premature for their staff to handle. They were essentially forced to do the work of a level 3 unit without any of the level 3 tools or expertise. And this is where the system started to snap. Internal records from 2015 show a unit in total crisis. The nurse manager at the time wrote that they were chronically understaffed and underskilled. Imagine being a nurse on a ward where you are expected to provide one-to-one care for a dying baby. But instead, you are stretched across multiple rooms because there simply are not enough people to go around. One consultant even sent an email to the chief executive warning that the staff were stretched thinner and thinner, and that when things finally broke, the casualties would be the lives of children. But the staffing was only one part of this nightmare. The physical state of the building was absolutely shocking. We are talking about a place where raw sewage was literally backing up into the sinks where the staff were supposed to wash their hands. There were leaks in the ceiling and pipes that were falling apart. Even worse, they found that the water taps were contaminated with a banned substances-resistant bug called Pseudomonas. For a premature baby with no immune system, that bacteria is a death sentence. There are even reports of staff having to stick nappies to the ceiling to catch leaking fluid. Knowing there is literal sewage backing up near premature babies, banned substances-resistant bacteria in the water, and a staff that is completely overwhelmed. Do you think a hospital like that is looking for the truth or a scapegoat? Tell me below. This was not a pristine medical environment, it was a disaster zone waiting to happen. The unit was eventually downgraded back to level 1 because they realized they could not safely care for these high-risk babies anymore. But by then, the deaths had already occurred, and the blame was already being shifted. What I found in my research was that many of these babies were not actually stable, as the prosecution claimed. They were very sick infants who were fighting for their lives in an environment that was working against them every single day. Some of them were suffering from severe pneumonia or infections that were missed or ignored by the senior doctors on duty. Instead of admitting that the hospital was failing these families, the narrative shifted to something much more sinister. It is easier to blame a single person for a spike in deaths than it is to admit that an entire system has collapsed under the weight of its own incompetence. When the pipes are leaking sewage and the doctors are only visiting the ward twice a week, you really have to wonder if anyone was actually focused on the babies at all. It is a chilling reality to face right now. We must also consider that during this period, there were also major issues with finding enough beds. The unit was acting way beyond its legal capacity. This meant that safety was often sacrificed just to accommodate more patients. It was not long before the management decided that they needed a simple target for all these growing failures. Lucy Letby was that chosen target. The Rota grid. It is a simple spreadsheet, really, just a grid of names and dates. But in this specific case, it was the primary weapon the prosecution used to convince 12 ordinary people that Lucy Letby was a serial killer. They showed the jury this chart where a series of infant deaths and collapses were lined up, and every single time, there was one name that appeared in every row: Lucy Letby. When you see a pattern like that, your brain immediately screams, guilty. It is a visual trick designed to do exactly that. And then, you start hearing experts mention a concept called the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. It sounds like something out of an old Western movie, but it is actually a deadly serious error in logic that can send an innocent person to prison. Imagine a guy who wants to be famous as the best marksman in the world. He does not actually aim for a target. Instead, he walks up to a blank barn wall and just starts firing his gun randomly. He shoots 20 holes into the wood. After he is finished, he takes a can of bright red spray paint and draws a perfect bullseye around the biggest cluster of bullet holes. Suddenly, he looks like a world-class shooter. But he is not. He just chose the data that made him look good after the shooting was already over. Because of that, we have to look at exactly how the police built this case against Lucy. They did not start with a list of every single death that occurred on the unit. No, they started with a list of suspicious deaths and collapses. But who decided what was suspicious? It was a small group of consultants who already suspected Lucy. They looked through the records and circled the events where Lucy was present. If a baby died or collapsed while she was at home, or on vacation, or simply not on that specific ward, those events were often labeled as natural, or unexplained but not suspicious, and left off the chart entirely. When I first looked at that grid showing Lucy present at every death, I thought, well, case closed. But at this point, I started questioning. What about the times she was not there? What I found in my research was that there were many other deaths during that period that were not included in the trial at all. If you put all the deaths back on that chart, the pattern starts to vanish. The truth is, Lucy Letby was a highly committed nurse. She worked more shifts and longer hours than almost anyone else on the unit. She was one of only a few nurses qualified to care for the most critical infants in the intensive care room. Statistically speaking, if you are the person who spends the most time on the ward with the sickest babies, you are much more likely to be there when something goes wrong. It is not murder, it is simple probability. But here is the real kicker, the element that should make you very angry. The police actually hired a professional statistician, a highly reputable expert named Professor Jane Hutton. They wanted her to help them prove that Lucy being there could not be a coincidence. But Professor Hutton told the police they were doing it all wrong. She warned them that they needed to look at all the data from the hospital, not just the pieces the police had chosen. She told them their graph was misleading and unscientific, And what did the police do next? Did they fix the chart? No, they fired her. They let her go and then kept right on, using that same flawed graph to build their case. They ignored the expert they hired because she would not say what they wanted to hear. In other words, the entire foundation of the case was built on a manipulated image. The jury was never told that a top-tier scientist had debunked the very chart they were staring at for months. They were led to believe that Lucy was the only common factor in these tragedies. But the real common factors were much more obvious: an overworked staff, a filthy building, and a management team desperate to protect their own reputations. If a police department fires their own expert for telling the truth, do you think they are really looking for justice? Tell me in the comments, if you were on that jury and you knew the police had ignored their own statistician, would you still have voted to convict? I really want to hear your take on this. It is a chilling thought. What happened next in this investigation was the introduction of the prosecution's star medical witness, Dr. Dewey Evans. If the grid was the visual hook, Dr. Evans provided the medical narrative that finally locked the cell door. But when you look closely at how this narrative was built, the science starts to look a lot more like science fiction. Dr. Evans, a retired general pediatrician, did not come into this case through a formal selection process. He actually reached out to the National Crime Agency and offered his services after reading about the case in the news. He eventually became the primary architect of the air embolism theory, which is the idea that Lucy was killing babies by injecting air into their veins or through their nasogastric tubes. The thing that is truly staggering, and quite frankly a huge shock to anyone in the medical profession, is how Dr. Evans reached these conclusions. He famously stated that in the very first case he was given, he looked at the notes for only 10 minutes over a cup of coffee before deciding it was a case of deliberate harm. Think about that. Most medical reviews of a single infant death take weeks of careful study, but he diagnosed a murder in the time it takes to finish a latte. From that 10-minute window, he built a list of 5 criteria to identify air embolism, including the claim that the babies were perfectly stable before collapsing and that there was no other medical explanation for their deaths. His most compelling evidence for the jury was something called patchy skin discoloration. He told the court that these LPM-WAPM rashes were the smoking gun of air being injected into the bloodstream. To support this, he relied heavily on a landmark medical paper published in 1989. This paper described a specific clinical marker known as the Lee sign. Dr. Evans convinced the jury that the rashes seen on these babies matched the descriptions in that 1989 research, which made his theory sound incredibly authoritative to a group of lay people who had never stepped foot in a neonatal unit. But here is where the story takes a dark and confusing turn, which means we have to talk about what the actual author of that 1989 paper, Dr. Shu Lee, has to say about it. Dr. Lee is one of the world's most respected neonatal experts, and when he finally saw how his work was being used in court, he was horrified. He actually testified at Lucy's appeal that Dr. Evans and the prosecution had interpreted his research completely wrong. Dr. Lee explained that the true Lee sign is not a patchy rash or blotchy skin. It is actually a very dramatic and specific site where bright red blood vessels appear like the branches of a tree against a dark blue background. This only lasts for a few minutes and looks like a Christmas tree lighting up under the skin. What the nurses at the hospital described were just common skin blotches, which Dr. Lee says can be caused by almost anything that makes a baby's circulation collapse. If a baby has severe pneumonia or sepsis, their body stops getting enough oxygen, and their skin will turn pale, blue, or In fact, Dr. Lee's international panel of 14 experts found that every single one of these 17 babies was actually very sick and deteriorating long before they collapsed. One baby had severe pneumonia that was getting worse, but because the doctors missed the signs, they blamed a nurse instead of the infection. Even the air found on some post-mortem X-rays, which Dr. Evans used as proof of murder, was debunked. Experts point out that 89% of babies who receive chest compressions during resuscitation will have air in their blood vessels. Additionally, bacteria can produce air in the body within only 25 minutes after death. Since the X-rays in this case were taken 3 days after the infants died, that air could have come from natural decomposition or the very efforts to save them. If the very expert who wrote the medical paper says the prosecution got it completely wrong, would you still trust the verdict? Let me know in the comments, because this feels like a massive bridge between medical fact and courtroom fiction. It is a terrifying realization that a jury was told a patchy rash equals murder, when in reality, it often just equals a very sick baby in a failing hospital. Which tells us that the prosecution was not looking for the truth. They were looking for a way to make their only suspect fit a theory that simply was not there. If there is one pillar that held up the entire case against Lucy Letby, it was the staggering allegation of insulin poisoning. For many people following the trial, the cases of Baby F and Baby L were the ultimate, undeniable proof of guilt. The jury actually handed down their very first guilty verdicts on these two specific cases. The logic seemed rock solid at the time. A baby had a massive, unexplained drop in blood sugar, a blood test showed extremely high insulin levels, and therefore, someone must have deliberately poisoned them. Once the jury believed she was a convicted poisoner, the judge essentially told them they did not need to delve too much into the ins and outs of the other cases. It made it incredibly easy for them to believe she was guilty of everything else. This is the part I couldn't get past. I read the timeline over and over, trying to make it make sense. Let us break down exactly what happened with Baby F. Because when you look closely at the medical evidence and the actual hospital shifts, the prosecution's story completely falls apart. First, we need to talk about the blood test that was used to claim these babies were poisoned. It is called an immunoassay test. The baby experienced a significant drop in blood sugar. Now, according to neonatal experts, this is actually incredibly common for premature infants who are sick and fighting infections, which this particular baby was. On top of that, there were major clinical issues with the delivery of sugar to the baby, and significant delays by the medical staff in recognizing and fixing the problem. So, the baby already had perfectly natural, medical reasons to suffer from low blood sugar. But instead of looking at their own delays in care, the doctors ordered a hypoglycemia screen. The results came back showing high insulin levels and low C-peptide levels, which usually indicates insulin was introduced from the outside. And this is important. The immunoassay test is fundamentally flawed when used in this kind of criminal context. It is absolutely not a forensic test. Medical experts, including Dr. Svelena Dimitrova, have pointed out that this specific test can sometimes pick up other molecules and mistakenly count them as free insulin. Because of this exact flaw, the manufacturer's own guidelines explicitly state that this test is not to be used for the diagnosis of external insulin administration. It is meant for general clinical guidance, not to lock someone in a prison cell for the rest of their life. Yet, the prosecution presented this test to the jury as absolute, undeniable proof of a murder attempt. But the most shocking part of the insulin theory is not even the flawed blood test. It is the timeline of the alleged poisoning itself. The prosecution claimed that Lucy injected a lethal dose of insulin directly into the intravenous nutrition bag, also known as a total parenteral nutrition, or TPN bag, that was hooked up to Baby F. There is just one massive, glaring problem with that theory. The nutrition bag for Baby F was changed during the night shift. Why? Because the baby's central line suddenly stopped working, which meant the nurses had to unexpectedly throw away the old bag. get a completely new line, and pull a fresh nutrition bag from the communal stock fridge. In other words, this was an unplanned emergency bag change that happened in the middle of the night. But Lucy Letby was not even in the hospital. She only worked the day shift. She had clocked out and gone home hours before that new bag was ever pulled out of the refrigerator. She was nowhere near the baby or the bag when the alleged poisoning took place. So, how did the prosecution explain this impossible timeline? When they realized their prime suspect was not even in the building, they had to pivot. They suddenly argued that Lucy must have sneaked into the ward's storage fridge before she went home and randomly injected insulin into the spare nutrition bags. They essentially asked the jury to believe that she booby-trapped the fridge, possessing some bizarre sixth sense to predict that baby F's line would fail hours later, and that the night nurse would miraculously reach into the fridge and select the exact bag she had secretly poisoned just for that specific baby. There was absolutely zero evidence that any bags were ever tampered with, nor was there any record of missing insulin from the tightly controlled hospital inventory. Does that sound like a calculated serial killer to you, or a prosecution team grasping at straws? Let me know what you think in the comments. Because to me, it sounds like a desperate attempt to force a square peg into a round hole, creating a phantom poisoner out of thin air just to make the charges stick. To truly comprehend how this case escalated from a failing neonatal unit to a full-blown murder investigation, we have to look at the toxic culture brewing behind the closed doors of the hospital. We have to look at the doctors who first pointed the finger at Lucy Letby, specifically senior consultants like Dr. Ravi Jayaram and Dr. Stephen Breary. As we established, this unit was a catastrophe. Babies were collapsing, and the medical staff were repeatedly failing to save these extremely premature, highly vulnerable infants. When highly paid, senior medical professionals face a spike in mortality rates on their watch, panic sets in. They are the ones ultimately responsible. They are the ones facing the devastating conversations with heartbroken parents. And they are the ones who could face career-ending negligence lawsuits. Instead of looking at the raw sewage, the chronic understaffing, or their own delayed responses to critical infections, these doctors started looking for an anomaly. They noticed that one particular nurse, the one who worked the most shifts and took on the most critical cases, was often present during these tragic events. They began whispering behind her back. Some even started referring to her with a horrific nickname, calling her Nurse Death. Meanwhile, the situation on the ward became increasingly hostile. Lucy Letby was not oblivious to these whispers. She knew she was being unfairly targeted by the senior male consultants. So, what did she do? She did not hide, and she did not run away. She actually fought back. Before there was ever a police investigation, before the world knew her name, Lucy Letby filed a formal, official grievance with the hospital's Human Resources Department. She officially accused these senior doctors of bullying, harassment, and victimizing her to cover up the unit's wider failings. And here is the absolute most shocking part of this entire timeline, something the mainstream media almost never talks about. She won. The hospital administration conducted an internal investigation into her grievance and found that the consultants had indeed acted improperly. The Human Resources Department upheld her complaint completely. The hospital executives concluded that Lucy was a dedicated, competent nurse who was being unfairly scapegoated by doctors who could not explain their own clinical failures. As a result, the hospital management ordered these powerful, senior consultants to write formal letters of apology to Lucy Letby. They were instructed to apologize for the immense stress and professional damage they had caused her. Furthermore, the hospital began drafting a managed plan to return her to her clinical duties on the neonatal ward. Imagine the sheer humiliation for these senior doctors. They tried to push the blame onto a junior female nurse, and the hospital told them they were wrong and forced them to apologize. That's when the narrative suddenly shifted from an internal human resources dispute to a criminal matter. Right after this massive blow to their egos, and with the hospital refusing to back their baseless suspicions, these doctors decided to escalate things. They bypassed standard medical reviews and pushed the situation directly to the criminal police. By bringing in the police, they effectively stopped any internal clinical audits or civil negligence lawsuits from parents in their tracks, because in the United Kingdom, a police investigation pauses civil actions. Suddenly, their medical mistakes were no longer the focus. Everyone was only looking at the nurse they had accused. If you are a doctor who just got officially reprimanded for bullying a nurse, and then you immediately call the police to accuse her of murder, do you think that is a genuine pursuit of justice or a desperate act of revenge? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. This was not a group of heroic whistleblowers trying to stop a serial killer. This looks exactly like a group of men terrified for their own careers, using the criminal justice system to silence the very woman who had just successfully exposed their hostile bullying. They turned a medical crisis into a murder mystery to save their own skins. Because if the general public, the health regulators, and the devastated families ever found out that these babies were dying from easily preventable infections, catastrophic management, and literal sewage leaking near their incubators, the entire hospital would have been ruined. The doctors would have been stripped of their medical licenses and faced total financial destruction from massive negligence lawsuits. So, instead of taking accountability, they sacrificed an innocent woman to the local criminal police force. From there, we have to confront the biggest question hanging over this entire case. If the medical evidence is truly full of holes, if the roster grid was manipulated, and if the doctors had a clear motive to cover up their own fatal mistakes, how did a jury of 12 ordinary people convict her? How did they confidently hand down 15 whole life sentences to a woman, sending her to a concrete cell forever, if the proof was crumbling? At this point, you are probably screaming at your screen, asking, why did not her defense team bring this up in court? And honestly, that is exactly what I asked. When I started drowning in the thousands of pages of court transcripts, I waited for the turning point. I wanted to read the moment her defense lawyer called an independent medical expert to the stand to tear the prosecution to shreds. I wanted a seasoned neonatologist to look the jury in the eye and explain that these babies actually died from severe pneumonia, raging infections, and a filthy environment. The problem is, that moment never came. The criminal justice system in the United Kingdom can be incredibly rigid, and courtroom strategies sometimes take a path that seems completely illogical to those of us watching from the outside. Lucy Letby, lead defense attorney, a highly experienced lawyer named Ben Myers, made a strategic legal decision that ultimately became the fatal blow to her entire life. He chose to rely solely on cross-examining the prosecution witnesses. He did not call a single independent medical expert to the stand to defend her. Not one. Stop for a second and think about what that means in reality. You have a jury made up entirely of lay people. They are hardworking folks like teachers, plumbers, and office workers. They are absolutely not medical doctors. They do not know how to read complex blood gas charts. They do not understand the flaws of an immunoassay test, and they have no idea what a real air embolism looks like. For 10 agonizing months, day after day, week after week, this jury sat in a sterile courtroom and listened to an overwhelming, relentless wave of information coming from only one side. They only heard the prosecution medical witnesses, like Dr. Dewey Evans. Repeating that murder was the only logical explanation for these tragedies. Without a defense medical expert to stand up, challenge that flawed science, and say that this was completely wrong, the jury was essentially flying blind. They had no alternative narrative. They had no choice but to believe the authoritative doctors pointing their fingers at the young nurse. And because the defense failed to counter the hard science, the prosecution was able to lean heavily into character assassination. They needed to paint a picture of Lucy not just as negligent, but as a cold, calculating monster. So, they deployed their ultimate weapon, which was the infamous sticky post-it notes. If you followed the news during the trial, you know exactly what I am talking about. Police searched her house and found small, messy notes covered in frantic, repetitive handwriting. The media immediately grabbed onto phrases taken completely out of context, like the words saying "I am evil," and "I did this." The prosecution waved these pieces of paper in front of the jury, declaring them to be the undeniable, written confessions of a twisted serial killer. But let us look at the actual, documented context of when those notes were written. They were not written immediately after a baby died. They were written many months later, when she had been removed from the neonatal unit, completely isolated from her friends, and officially informed she was under investigation for multiple murders. She was a young woman living alone, suffering from a severe, medically diagnosed mental breakdown. She was being relentlessly bullied and blamed by the exact senior doctors she once trusted. Those notes were not a calculated confession. They were the spiraling thoughts of a woman experiencing extreme psychological trauma. If you were stripped of your career and repeatedly called a murderer by failing doctors, would your private diary entries look like a confession? Do you think those frantic notes prove she is a killer, or do they just prove she was pushed to the absolute brink? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section right now, because I am very curious to see what you all think about this one massive tragedy today. We have walked through the darkest corridors of this story together, peeling back the layers of a narrative that the public was simply expected to swallow without asking any questions. We have examined the crumbling, unsanitary walls of a level 2 hospital ward that was entirely unequipped to handle the extremely premature and critically ill infants thrust into its care. We have looked closely at the shifting timelines, the highly contested medical theories about air blockages, and the impossibly flawed insulin tests that were presented as absolute facts to a jury of ordinary people. We have also seen the deeply unsettling internal politics of a hospital where senior doctors, facing the collapse of their own department, decided to point fingers at a junior nurse who had actually filed a grievance against them first. When you take a step back and look at the entire picture, the narrative of a solitary serial killer roaming the halls at night begins to completely fall apart before our very eyes. Instead, what emerges is a staggering portrait of systemic failure on a scale that is truly difficult to comprehend. We are looking at a scenario where a sequence of tragic, natural infant deaths and catastrophic clinical errors were collected, repackaged, and aggressively prosecuted to clear the names of the people who were actually in charge of the facility. The hospital authorities desperately needed a simple explanation for a highly complex and deeply embarrassing disaster. They needed someone to take the fall so they could entirely avoid a lengthy public inquiry into their disastrous management practices. I started this investigation thinking I was tracking the mindset of a cold-blooded monster. But what I found was a medical system terrified of its own reflection, willing to sacrifice a dedicated nurse to hide their own fatal mistakes. This realization fundamentally changes everything we thought we knew about the justice system. It makes you wonder how many other people are sitting in concrete cells right now because a group of powerful individuals decided to protect their own careers. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that the institutions designed to keep us safe are fully capable of destroying an innocent life just to maintain their funding and avoid a massive public scandal. This case isn't just about Lucy Letby. It's a chilling reminder of what happens when we blindly trust institutions. When investigators rely on flawed statistics, when doctors protect their reputations over the truth, and when the system investigates itself, the truth is the first casualty. But we cannot let the truth stay buried. The families of those poor infants deserve to know exactly what happened in that hospital. They deserve to know if their babies died from preventable infections and poor hygiene rather than the hands of a nurse. If we allow this verdict to stand without questioning the deeply suppressed evidence, we are basically handing hospitals a permission slip to blame their worst failures on their lowest-ranking employees. I want to hear from you. After looking at these 5 suppressed facts, do you think Lucy Letby is a calculated killer or the victim of the biggest NHS cover-up in history? Drop your thoughts down in the comments. Let's debate this. The conversation cannot simply stop here. There are still ongoing legal appeals, massive independent reviews, and a rapidly growing chorus of international medical experts demanding that the courts look at the actual clinical science instead of relying on manipulated nursing schedules and completely out-of-context diary entries. We have a very serious responsibility to keep a very close eye on exactly how the government handles these brand new revelations over the coming months. We must demand total transparency from the authorities who put her away. If the public ignores this situation and blindly accepts the official narrative without questioning the incredibly weak medical evidence, we are setting a terrifying precedent for the entire future of healthcare justice. Every single healthcare professional and concerned citizen around the world should be paying close attention to this case right now. It is absolutely crucial that we do not let this story fade away into the background noise of the daily news cycle. Lucy Letby is currently sitting in a maximum security prison, facing the rest of her life behind bars. But if she didn't kill those babies, which tells us the real reasons those infants died have never been fixed. And if that's true, who's going to be the next scapegoat? Stay safe and keep questioning. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you found this investigation insightful, please leave a comment, like, and subscribe to our channel for more detailed true crime documentaries. Your continued support means everything to us. Stay safe, always keep questioning the official narratives, and see you next time.